Today is the author interview and book signing event that I'm particularly pleased to have Stephenie Foster to talk to us about her book, Fighting for Women and Girls. Well, I grew up in a family that was very supportive of women and had some very strong women, and I thought I could do anything I wanted to do. I didn't realize there were things that I didn't even consider doing. This book describes how to be active and how to advocate for the roles of women and gender equality. One is education. Two is creating economic opportunities. Three is eliminating gender-based violence. And four is participating in politics and public life. Stephenie Foster has been fighting for women and girls her entire career. She has deep expertise in women's economic and political empowerment and decades of experience on Capitol Hill, the executive branch, and in the State Department. She represented the U.S. State Department overseeing our work on global women's issues and has traveled to or worked in over 100 countries. I think there are about 187 countries, and so she's been to 100 of them. In 2011, she was a Women in Civil Society officer at the U.S. Embassy in Kabul, Afghanistan. She was most recently at the Climate Change Conference in Glasgow. She's a founding partner of Smash Strategies, which provides strategic advice to ensure investments on women and girls are effective and transformational. She's now going to spend a year as a special assignment with the State Department on relocating and helping some of the Afghans who are in the US or in other countries. She's being interviewed by Jenny Luray, who's Vice President of Strategy and Communications at the National Health Organization called Research America. She has a long history in advocacy on behalf of women. She served as Chief of Staff to the former Senator Barbara Mikulski and was the director of the White House Office on Women's Initiatives and Outreach under President Clinton. She led the Suman G. Komen Advocacy Alliance and was its president, and most recently served as the board chair for Planned Parenthood of the Metropolitan Washington region. She currently serves as an appointee for the Women's Commission in Washington, D.C. To start, I'll read a quote from the book. If women participated in their economies at the same rate as men, the global GDP would increase by 12 to 28 trillion dollars. I'm now going to tell you a brief story about an experience I had in a taxi cab in New York. I don't know where the driver was from, but I made a statement that said that I supported economic independence for women. He said to me, "You have it wrong." I waited. He then said, "It is economic sustenance that's important so that women and children can survive."
To talk about women's equality, women's empowerment, surrounded by these gorgeous clothes is really something. But particularly to get a chance to talk with you about your book. It's so full of information, tips. I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about the structure of the book in a minute, because I think it's really unique. I want to first start out by asking you what led you to write a book. I mean, you speak all over the world, even during COVID. I know you couldn't travel as much, but you were online everywhere. You write blogs. You're all over the place, but why a book?
I'll answer that in a minute, but thank you to all of you for coming. I have to say we have the, just so those of you who are in the Mikulski world, there are several of you in the audience. Dr. Shannon Kula is on the line here. So, and so thank you to you for coming and everyone else online and the Mikulski group here, Julia and me. And Anne, I said,
Oh, I'm sorry.
that's okay. So anyway, thank you all for coming. Many connections, and really happy that we're all able to talk about this book. So the reason I wrote the book, I often say it was my COVID project. I couldn't go to events at night. There were no events to go to, no dinners. And, this was something I could do, but that's really, I think, a more kind of flip way to talk about why I wrote the book. I really wrote it because throughout all my travels, and we all in this room talk to a lot of people who are passionate about women and girls, gender equality, fighting for a better world in many ways. And there's always that question of, what can I do? Like, how can I actually make a difference? And so having lots of conversations, particularly with the demographic, I would say, of women between like up to maybe in their early 30s, really sort of searching for their advocacy kind of home and how they're going to think about advocacy. So I decided to write a book that would set out the big issues, which I think can be both barriers to women's participation and full participation in the world, and also can really drive a positive change, the 4 issues that I lay out, but also giving people really concrete things to do. So arguments about why more women being in the economy is good for everyone, why having more girls in school makes a difference, why more women in political office. So really trying to give people those arguments, in addition to lessons learned, things that have worked in other places, ideas that to give people so that they can take this information and kind of move it out into the world.
There's so many issues that impact women. You chose 4.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to delve into each of those in a minute, but perhaps you could just share what those 4 were and maybe why you chose those 4.
Sure. I mean, the 4 I chose, and you're right, there are many, many issues. I chose 3 where I think we see the data is so positive if these issues are addressed. I chose girls' education, or education for women and girls, because obviously we know that for every additional year a girl stays in school, the outcomes are very positive in terms of lower, they marry at a later age, have smaller children, participate in the economy more, particularly focusing on girls in secondary education, which is when we all develop those analytical skills that are so important for being effective members of society. Economic independence or sustenance, really looking at how women are part of the economy, how women can really be able to use their talents and skills. They're able to really focus on how to build jobs for other people, how to build businesses, how to participate in the labor force in a really effective way. And political participation. Many of us have worked for political leaders, but it's really not only about getting women elected to office, but the importance of women in appointed office and the importance of women's political participation at every level, from the school board to the Senate to the White House. And we see lots of positive outcomes in terms of policy around those issues, the issues that get addressed, how money is allocated through the political process, and just ensuring that women's voices are part of every decision that gets made, because every decision is about our lives, not just the ones that sometimes people think of, like childcare and health and education, but defense and national security, agriculture, everything matters. And then lastly, I really focused on gender-based violence as one of the biggest, I think, barriers to women's full participation in society, because it does have such a personal drag on individual women, but also there is a cost to it that we all bear. So those were the 4 issues I picked, and I picked them knowing I'm missing a lot of issues. I try to embed in the book a way to be an advocate that you can use for any issue, so that if I didn't talk about it in the book, or I only mention it, that people are able to take the lessons and then really move forward with them.
And you did that really well. And I want to talk about that, because in a way it is a handbook about being an advocate and a leader. You provide a lot of background on those 4 issues, but there's some really basic skills and techniques that you lay out. You provide a lot of statistics. One of the things you do that I think is so worthwhile is you really raise the importance of asking questions. And it really is a theme throughout the book. And you lay out questions that one could ask about a given issue. It really resonated with me, because I think a lot of women don't act because they think they aren't informed enough. And by giving women a tool to ask questions, and in a sense, you're saying it's okay that you don't know, but you can learn more. Could you say more about the importance of question asking, and not to offend any men in the audience, but at least in my own marriage, I find that my husband is less inclined to ask questions. Not gender stereotyping, but, and also on the Hill, we found women holding back because they didn't feel they knew the answers, and just expending a lot of energy to really ask the right questions.
Well, I mean, I think there's so much just, one of the fundamental issues around gender equality is the whole idea that we need to understand first, how are women and men and boys and girls treated differentially by sort of the system we live in, right? We have a system that, whether we want to acknowledge it or not, is, it's very embedded with male values, and we all live in it. So asking those questions, how many girls are in that science class? Are you teaching, how are you teaching? Are you making sure that teachers know to call on girls and boys equally in the classroom? Everything from that to 2 stories I want to tell. One, I actually was just speaking to a friend yesterday about her church is sponsoring an Afghan family coming here, and they're talking about doing cultural kind of, education with all their church members who are going to be part of this effort. And she said, as I was in the meeting, I realized that every single person who was coming to talk to us about cultural competence was a man about Afghanistan. So I said, why aren't we asking any women? And of course, then that ended up, they asked a woman to come, and, there are different issues to be aware of. So even a simple question like that, right, makes a difference, because not only does it raise the issue of who we listen to, but also ensuring that as those people are taking on this amazing task, that they understand fully the difference between some, men and women in terms of the culture and what might be important. Everything from, and I'll say this because not only because many of us here did work for Senator Mikulski, but I mean, I think a lot about when Senator Mikulski and Senator Olympia Snowe and Connie Morella and Pat Schroeder, members of the House, asked the question of the National Institute of Health right up the way. And I write about this in the book, like, why are drugs that are being marketed in the US at that time only being tested on men? This was the case at the time. It was not that long ago. I think it was actually in the 80s, late 80s. And they asked that question, like, why is this premier institution that we all count on, not only in the US, but around the world, testing drugs and medical devices only on men? And so they asked that question and really changed the way that medical research happens in this country. And so that's at a big level, right? At a like meta level that affects pretty much everyone in the world in a way. I think that's really a very important question. And also understanding why it's so important to have diverse voices in Congress or as decision makers, because just having those 4 women were really able at that time to make a difference in something that really affected all of us.
So asking questions then doesn't only make one a better activist or leader, but actually those questions can in themselves propel change.
Yes, I think they do. And I think it's asking questions for the information, but also being strategic about those questions propelling change. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about the role of the internet in organizing and activism, and particularly since your book, I know, is somewhat aimed, I mean, at least I think will be very appealing to women like my daughter's age in their 20s, and they are digital natives. What impact has the internet had on women's ability to organize and to be advocates? And have you seen a difference in how the Gen Zers are organizing online?
Well, different than I would, certainly. I am not a Gen Zer. I mean, I'd say a couple things. I mean, yes, of course, the internet is a wonderful tool. I also like to always point out that, 100 years ago, last year, women in this country, at least most women, got, fought for, and the 19th Amendment was was ratified and became part of the Constitution. And those women who were active in the effort for the 19th Amendment which was a really radical undertaking, right? They did all of that without the internet. So I always think we need to remember that change did happen in a way before the internet. And if you look at it, and I talk a little bit about it in the book, I don't want to quote the numbers from memory because I'll get them wrong, but they spent years on it and had all these petitions to state legislatures. They traveled the country, they organized like crazy, and they did all of that. Think about it 100 years ago, and were successful. So I think organizing itself is like has happened for many years. Of course, the internet can help propel that forward. I think it can also be a bit of a negative sometimes because some voices get become amplified on the internet that maybe really aren't that reflective of kind of the majority opinion, and the loudest voices really can become really big on the internet. I mean, I would say it's a wonderful tool and people should use it, but it also has downsides in terms of, and I talk a little bit about this in the book, and actually I noticed the Biden administration made an announcement about a new initiative to address online violence against women in politics, because it's not just targeted at women, but often at dissidents. And, there is this whole issue about how to ensure that people who are online safely, and that the internet isn't used as a tool to basically deter people who are being activists or breaking gender norms or other norms in general.
Really interesting. Well, let's touch on some of the issues that you touch on in the book, and gender-based violence. We just finished a movement called 16 Days of Activism, which you refer to in your book. Could you talk a little bit about that and the purpose of it?
Sure. I mean, 16 Days of Activism, today is the last day, I think, of it. And it's a global kind of phenomena where every year people really focus on the issues of gender-based violence and try to, really push people for activism on it. And I think that one of the biggest issues that we see in gender-based violence is just that it's very pervasive and people don't really like to talk about it still. I think there's more discussion of it now. The hashtag Me Too movement. Obviously, there's been a lot of discussion around sexual harassment and sexual abuse, but I still think it's a tough issue for people to talk about. It does have a huge drag. Obviously, it's a human rights issue. It has a huge drag, though, on all of us. And I don't mean to undercut the tremendous impact it has on the individual and that person's family. And I should say gender-based violence isn't just targeted at women. There's violence against women, which is one term. Gender-based violence is another. They're not the same. There is violence directed at men who break social norms, might be seen as not masculine enough. Sometimes there are, lots of issues in terms of sexual violence in conflict that can be targeted at both men and women, girls and boys. So I say that because I want to be mindful of this isn't just an issue that affects women and girls. It does affect mostly women and girls, but not wholly. And so I think it's important to think about understanding that, yes, it's a human rights issue. Yes, it impacts people, but it also has an impact on the economy in terms of businesses seeing lots of lost productivity. People obviously can't really focus at work if they're being stalked or they're in a really abusive relationship. So really important to think about how to address those issues, again, for the people involved, but also because it does have an impact on all of us.
You've done a tremendous amount of work globally. Is this an issue that spans different countries and cultures?
Actually, I should say that. So we often think maybe in the US or places in Europe that, this is an issue that only happens other places. And then obviously, or I shouldn't say obviously, but it is not the case. So globally the statistics depend on the country, but globally, probably about 35% of women have been the subject of some kind of gender-based violence. And that is the number that is traditionally used in the US as well. And when you think about it, it's everything from the kind of things we think about, domestic abuse, to, forced marriage or trafficking. I mean, all sorts of things, if you think about them, kind of fall under this rubric. So it's pervasive, it's widespread, it's everywhere. So I think we this is an issue that particularly helps us, I think, as Americans, be mindful of the fact that we are, we're not, we are unique in that we have a society that's free of gender-based violence. We have a society that has gender-based violence in it, as is every place in the world. And it's, there are lots and lots of efforts. I think there's much more awareness now. And I do think people are trying to be very proactive and really calling out perpetrators of gender-based violence. I would just say personally, when I was a young person, which was a very long time ago, I'm very impressed by what I see younger women now really calling out things that I don't think I think I sort of thought was just what happened, in life. So.
I hadn't heard of the Debbie Smith Act
Yeah,
before I read your book.
Yeah. So Debbie Smith, I don't know if any of you know of her. She is actually a local woman in Virginia. She was raped, and her rape kit was, stored in some locker, cold locker, and never tested. And she was able to, because of her advocacy, get a law passed in Virginia that rape kits be tested in a certain, I think it's 60 days after they're actually collected. Her rape kit was tested. Her perpetrator was arrested, convicted, and jailed. And it's interesting because she says that really helped her, kind of come to closure on this really horrible thing that happened to her. And I would say also Lauren, who's here, we were at something the other night, and a woman who, another book talk, was saying how she had a kind of a similar situation, horrible thing happened, and she found being an advocate for better health services for women who had been the victims of sexual abuse to be very cathartic to her.
Mhm.
Her perpetrators were also caught as well, but it was an interesting linkage. So I don't know if that's, Debbie Smith says she, in all the Washington Post reports, that she feels that she felt this sense of closure, and she was able to take her experience and make life better for other people. And this woman that we spoke to the other night basically said the same thing. So it's an interesting connection between advocacy, taking your personal experience and kind of moving forward.
Going from victim to
Right.
empower,
To
an
feel like
empowered
you can make a difference. Yeah.
You also talk about how men can play a role in gender-based violence, particularly violence against women. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think, we all know that the vast majority of men are not perpetrators of gender-based violence. I think, and obviously I'm not a man, but I do think what you hear when you talk to men is that, and we all see this in life, right? People make sort of snide comments about women or belittling comments. And I think one thing that, I've talked to a lot of men who are advocates in this is just don't participate in that, right? If somebody is some guy is being a jerk, I could say something stronger, but say I don't want you to have that conversation, or that's not how I think about women. And I think it's just really important to, if you're a man who wants to be helpful, and I do think most men do, to really just say to other men, stop that behavior and call it out when you see it.
Great.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about economic opportunity.
Yeah.
And we're in a female-owned business,
Yeah.
which is wonderful. And obviously supporting women-owned businesses,
Yeah.
is a good first step.
You can buy wonderful jackets.
I
here.
know, one that I will be taking advantage of shortly. Do you have other insights on how we can support women-owned businesses?
One thing, and I'm just going to say this in the book because I want to make sure to get this right. Obviously, supporting women-owned businesses is really important. I think one thing you can do is ask if a business that you go to is a woman-owned business, or if it is, ask that businesswoman to, make sure to highlight that to people because they want to know that. The statistics are that startups founded by women are 20% more likely to generate revenue and have a 35% higher return on investment than those founded by men. The problem is that, women-owned businesses and are funded by investors at the same level as male-owned businesses, and there's quite a disparity there. There are efforts to change that. Funds that only invest in women and minority-owned businesses or Black-owned businesses, Latina-owned businesses. But other things you can do is, if you work somewhere, which many of us do, ask about the hiring and promotion and retention practices at your workplace. Again, Lauren and I were at this event the other night, and one of the women was talking about, they had a whole issue around how to redesign their sexual harassment policy at the workplace. And they got everybody involved and found that younger women had a different view of, they wanted more focus on helping the women and men who might have been the subject of sexual harassment. They were less interested in sort of only focusing on, accountability. They wanted there to be accountability, but they also wanted there to be service provision and support. And so that was an interesting thing, making sure that everybody's part of that process. Asking about pay, that's a huge one. There's still quite a huge pay gap. I will say, and I would feel remiss not to say this, right? COVID has had a huge impact on everything. And what the statistics show is that globally, women are about 40% of the labor force, 39%, but 54% of job loss during COVID was women not going back to work. A lot of it is because women are in jobs that closed a lot during COVID, retail, small businesses, and also the additional burden of home, your kids being at home, home supervision of your kids' schooling, et cetera. So I think that's a big issue. And then also my favorite is, if you own stock, you can, and you get that little thing in the mail that tells you to vote for who's on the board. You can vote for women who are who are being put forward as board members in corporations, because we know that all male boards or boards of any group of people tend to have groupthink. And the data shows that when boards have more women, companies actually tend to be more profitable, and they tend to not have as many sort of negative things that lead to liabilities because there's less groupthink. So those are just a wide range of different things.
So just being a consumer, a choosy consumer,
Yes.
can also be a form of advocacy. And to that point, there's something called the Women's Empowerment Principles.
Yeah.
Is that a tool that we can use to look at large corporations and understand their record on women? Can you explain that, or any other tools that we can use to make sure we're spending our dollars, with companies that are promoting women?
Well, I mean, certainly the Women's Empowerment Principles, which were and are a project of UN Women, and it's 7 principles. Companies can commit to the principles. They're everything from fair workplace standards, fair pay, anti-harassment policies. And of course, there's one principle on reporting. And so you can look on their website. There are, I think, now over 5,000 companies, mostly quite large, that are members or have joined on to the principles. And you can see, it's everyone from I'm trying to think of Pepsi and, all lots of Avon, lots of these big entities, Procter and Gamble, Microsoft, Facebook actually is also, we might have other issues with Facebook, but they did commit to the principles. So, but you can, see who's committed. And then that's an advocacy tool to kind of hold companies accountable. And then also, I think just reporting, there's looking at the reporting in the newspaper every day, or, seeing how other groups are kind of evaluating who's out there, what they're doing for women employees, how they participate in the economy. I think there's just so many ways to kind of get a sense of that. I would say I do think a lot of businesses that we would consider to be, sort of consumer facing, like things like Procter and Gamble, Unilever, clothing companies, they tend to have a lot more women are consumers generally, but the companies that tend to really focus on their women consumers also tend to, I have seen, do pretty well with their employees. They're trying to make sure they're consistent in terms of their outward and then their internal kind of work on these issues.
I'm going to ask 2 more questions, then we'll turn it over to the audience.
Okay.
And I've got a few more as well at the end, if there's time. But I heard the voice of Senator Mikulski in your book, not surprisingly, since those of us who worked for her were greatly impacted by her, as were many of her constituents. She had this saying, which was, I can make a difference, but together we can make change. And you strongly advise women to join groups that are already existing.
Yeah.
If there is a group around an issue that you're propelled by, concerned with. Can you say more about that?
Sure. Oh, sorry. Oh, was it? Oh, no, that's okay. I was wondering if you were, sure. I mean, I think, look, everybody brings a different perspective to an issue. I think it's really important. And I outline in the book a lot of organizations that are working on issues. It's not exhaustive, certainly. It's really not. But I think, I think we often, not just in the space around gender and women's leadership, people want to start their own organization or their own, have their own kind of NGO. And I think that's fine, but I think searching to see if there's already a group that's working on the issue is really helpful. And maybe you can bring a different perspective, right, to the issue. It might be that somebody's working on gender-based violence, but they've never had a business kind of perspective, or somebody's working on political participation, but they haven't focused on, say, ensuring that more Asian women are running for office, or more young women, or more LGBTQI plus, people. So, I mean, looking to see if there's a group that's already out there that you can kind of be part of. If there really isn't, I think fine to start one. I just think it's important to sort of join up with people who are already doing work. I also think, you have to have a comfort level. Some people prefer being in a smaller group or a more sort of newer, I don't mean smaller, I mean newer, kind of a group that might be able to be more edgy and kind of out there. Some people might prefer to be in a group that's more established because it has kind of longer history and has different kinds of relationships in the community or with decision makers. So I think it's just looking at all of those different issues.
And of course, there are groups at many levels, right? Local level, your
Right.
church, your synagogue, at the city level, right?
Right.
National, and you go into that. I mean, your resources in here are just amazing.
Well, thank
I
you.
was going through it going, wait, I never heard of that group.
Oh, well, there you go.
Last question. You've worked closely for and around a number of really incredible women elected leaders, obviously Senator Mikulski, but also Hillary Clinton. You've worked closely with Jean Shaheen and many others. I was going to ask you, what did you take from those women that made its way into the book? But that would be a long conversation.
Yeah,
But
don't do that.
can you mention just one or two things that really stand out to you that those women possess, that they took into the trenches every day, that distinguish their activism and their leadership?
I mean, I'd say two things. They were very authentic, like they're themselves. And I think that's true of leaders generally. I think the most effective leaders are authentic. They don't try to be someone they're not. And I think that's true with, everyone I've ever worked for, whether it's been a man or a woman. The most, I think, powerful leaders are authentic. And I think people like Senator Mikulski, Jean Shaheen, all the other women out there who made such a difference, I think they bring their life experience and are willing to put it in the mix, and are also willing to confront their colleagues when they don't listen. Which maybe doesn't happen as much anymore, but I think of many times when we all were at the early years working for Senator Mikulski, by the way, who represented Maryland, the state in which we are sitting, when she was one of 2 women senators, and now we're in the upwards of 20 plus. So it's a different time, and I think I hope also these women have been trailblazers for other women, and I think they have. That's another thing they brought to the table.
And she also taught us that there were men that were incredibly helpful to her. She called them her Galahads.
Her Galahads,
So
yes.
we also have to look for our Galahads.
Yes.
Do we have some questions? All right, would you like me to read them? Okay, great.
Oh my God, okay.
All
Oh,
right,
that was the
let's see.
paper. I was like, what are people writing out there? Okay.
Let's see. All right. I'm not gonna skip over them. I'm just seeing if there's a good order. Okay, let's see. How do you suggest we can work with women empowerment in developing countries, considering the cultural differences?
I mean, look, I think there are women in every country around the world who are working, women and men, but working really hard to make their countries a better place. I think we often have a lot to learn from them. I think that they have sometimes been very ahead of us. So I want to start by saying that, because often So if you ask the question, where does the United States stand in terms of the number of women who are in Congress? I'm not going to make all of you answer, but the answer is we're 77th on the list. We aren't really doing super well. And we were lower before this, in 2020 and 2018, many more women were elected. So we have a lot to learn from the countries that are above us on the list. So just in one example, and I think that's really important. So we, I think, need to be humble about what we are, who we are, what we know, what we bring to the table. I do think people can learn from us, but I think we can also learn from people in every country around the world. I think as we work, as someone who's worked globally, I think it's important to be respectful of that, to understand that, if you're in a country trying to help move forward issues in that country, working with the people who live there, work there, understanding how they see the issues, what's important to them, how they prioritize them. I think that's really, really important. But I do think it's always helpful for us to be humble about our accomplishments. I will say, when you look at the countries, politics is easy because it's easy to rank number of women in parliament or Congress, as we call it. And the countries at the top of the list are, probably countries people don't think about. It's like Rwanda is the highest, of course. They have about 60% of women in their parliament. Countries like Cuba, Mexico, very high on the list. So, they're not the countries we always think of. I think the highest country that's in Europe, because that's what we often say, it's the Nordics, is Iceland. And I think it's like number 8 or something like that. I can't know exactly for right now, but anyway, it's just important for us to be humble as we think about it, and also talk to women at every level. It's not just women who are elite, but how can we ensure that women who are at the grassroots are also part of the process?
So let's segue to Afghanistan.
Okay,
We've got a few questions on Afghanistan, which just a little something about.
Yeah.
So what now? What can be done to protect women from losing all that was gained over the last 20 years in Afghanistan?
Sure. I'll talk a little bit about Afghanistan. I did just go back to the State Department for a very short-term project working on Afghanistan. So just to say that, so people know, working on kind of gender issues around Afghanistan. Look, I think, again, it's really incumbent on all of us to think about what's gone on in a couple of ways. Like, there are a lot of Afghans, men and women, who are now here or in other countries that are not Afghanistan. I think calling on them, talking to them about what can be done in Afghanistan. They obviously, many of them just left, or they have family members there. I think that's really important. And I think, the challenge is figuring out a way to ensure that women who remain are able to participate in the process. So there's a lot right now, of course, around whether or not we should recognize the Taliban, which we have not, the United States, and also looking on conditioning assistance, because obviously Afghanistan is in a horrible crisis. I think the World Food Program, or the World Health Organization, I'm never going to get this right, just came out recently saying that only 5% of Afghans, 5%, okay, 5, not 50, not 15, only 5% of Afghans have enough to eat right now. And so it's a huge humanitarian crisis. The banking system has collapsed, et cetera. So really trying to figure out, I think doing advocacy around how to make sure that the entities that are working in Afghanistan are taking into account the needs that women and girls have that are different. I think that's sort of, on an advocacy level, the best thing to do. Like, there are a lot of people on the ground trying to be helpful, but I think it's important that they always are asked, are you sure that the needed assistance is getting to women and girls, or women and children, and not just making assumptions about how assistance is distributed, for example.
Okay. I want to just pivot to another hot topic, which is
topic.
Roe v. Wade. So can you talk about the potential impact of the likely end of Roe v. Wade, or at least major impacts on that decision?
Well, I mean, so we certainly don't know, but I mean, if you read the paper, it's not looking like the decision is gonna,
Stand in its present form?
stand in its present form. I think this is a perfect example of why advocacy is so important at every level. I mean, I think and there is a tremendous amount of advocacy going on, both around the big picture, sort of, there's a piece of legislation that has been introduced and that people are trying to pass to codify Roe v. Wade. I mean, I think that's a really big advocacy opportunity. I think at the local level, supporting providers, big advocacy opportunity. I think, at the sort of grassroots level, again, figuring out how to support people, whether it's through, sort of funds for access to reproductive health services. I think this is like this is a huge issue, I mean, I hate to say this, but like, there's just so much advocacy opportunity for, in my view, the wrong reasons. But I do think it's a place where taking sort of some of the ideas here in the book and thinking about how to ask the questions and make sure that people are really thinking about advocacy at the legal level, or, in the judicial system, in Congress, in state legislatures, in city councils, and then helping provide services to people who need them.
Speaking of the groups that are working on behalf of reproductive rights and women's equality in general, this questioner said that they are always looking for good examples. So what are some examples of groups that you think are really doing a great job today? And they didn't say US or global, but perhaps you could touch on both.
Sure. I mean, I think there are groups at every level. I think it really depends on the issue that, you want to work on. I mean, just kind of going through, and I can touch on a couple of them that I think are really good in terms of the issues that are, I think, the most kind of at the top right now. Women's political participation. I mean, I think groups like, most of the groups are sort of affiliated with either the Democratic or Republican Party. I do think on the Democratic side, of course, Emily's List, which has sort of been around for a long time, supporting Democratic pro-choice women, does a great job. Emerge is another group on the Democratic side that does similarly. There are a couple of Republican groups, though fewer, but there are some, and I mentioned them in the book. I don't feel like I'm really as able to talk about their impact in the most sort of granular way, but I also think in this space, like Running Start, which really tries to encourage women from the high school level to get engaged in politics, because we know that if women are student body presidents, they tend to run for office at, post high school much more. The statistics show that, large numbers of women who were in elected office were active in their student councils, of course, or the Girl Scouts or some kind of group like that. So I think that all the groups that really try to engage young women. I do think groups like the Girl Scouts and Girl Up and all that really help young women develop their confidence are super important. And on the economic sphere, I think it really, again, sort of depends. There are groups that really are focused on identifying women for board seats and high level jobs like Catalyst and groups like that. And then also groups that help small businesses really be catalyzed, like there's the National Association of Women Business Owners, and then some very specific groups for different sectors of the economy. So I think, there are a lot of great groups there. I try to list a lot of them here. I was sort of excited because I didn't list one group and they kind of got mad at me. So then I felt like, oh, they really wanted to be in my book. But I do think that's sort of also incumbent on everybody to think about, like, who else is out there that we don't know about, or that is really kind of an up and coming group that maybe deals with an issue that we haven't thought about. I think sometimes if we think about, for example, the Me Too movement, right? It was that hashtag was started, 10 years ago by Tarana Burke, and then it kind of wasn't something that people used, and all of a sudden people use it again. And so making sure that as groups are working on sexual harassment, that we're being true to the people who started the movement, which is, in this case, Black women.
Got a few questions about younger women,
Mm-hmm.
girls and younger women. How can we help young children elementary and middle school age be more aware of the power and abilities of women?
Well, sure. I mean, I think, the statistics show that part of the reason we want more women in every kind of profession is that it's, it helps unleash all this talent, right? And it helps build stronger societies and more stable societies. And it gives opportunity, but also the statistics show that when boys see women in these jobs, they actually then think that women can do these jobs, right? That is also important, because you don't want a situation where that we often have where, people say girls can't do that job. I just was listening to this US Summit for Democracy program. The Summit for Democracy was this week, and Catherine Tai, who is the US Trade Representative, was saying that when she was in elementary school, she said she wanted to be a scientist, and the boys in her class said girls could not be scientists. So she became an economist, and then she's now our US trade rep. So, okay, but she clearly didn't really listen. But her point was that, right, that she said these kids in her class said girls aren't scientists, they can't wear white lab coats. So I think, the more we have an expansive and more diverse set of people, whether it's men and women or different ethnic groups, different ages, just however you want to slice who we are, I think it gives everyone the sense and the reality that everybody can do everything. And we need to be encouraging that, because what we really need to do is unleash talent around the globe. We have a lot of problems today. I don't need to tell anyone in this room that, or anybody who's at all thinking about the world that, and we just need as many people as we can to be able to use their talents to their fullest to solve these problems and to come up with what we can do to do that. So I think, giving people that sense that everybody is able to do everything. Obviously people should use their talents appropriately. The other thing is also, working with teachers. There are groups of teachers now. There's a particular group in Africa, actually, that's worked a lot on curriculum to help teachers understand about calling on, this whole issue of making sure you call on boys and girls at the same rate, that you don't just ask boys about science and girls about, whatever, English or whatever languages, because we always think girls are good at language and boys are good at science. That's sort of the norm, right? So thinking about this group has really worked on curricula to try to address those issues. And I think those kinds of things are also important. And I do mention that the organization in the book, they've done a lot of great work to really, make sure that we're all collectively across the globe doing that.
I've got just a couple more questions here. And then, Lauren, do we have any on the line on the chat? Because I can't see the chat from here. Let me know. I'm going to go forward. So we talked a little bit about the activism of women who are Gen Z, but we talked more about the kind of methods and less about the issues that they're interested in. And so there's a question, talk more about under 40 activism. What are their particular areas of focus? And are there any approaches that we haven't discussed that women under 40 are using?
Okay, so when I went to Glasgow for the climate change conference, this really made me realize that if I didn't realize it before, climate change, right? I think there's a lot of issues, obviously, that young people have seeing their world. They are young, and when they look out 70 years, if people are going to live to be 90, right? 70 years, we're not doing so well in this whole climate situation. So I think that's huge. If we think about Greta, she's not the only Greta Thunberg. Obviously, she's become very well known and has done amazing things. But when I was at in Glasgow, I interviewed this young woman who also was a climate activist. She's like 25. She'd already run for, the European Parliament and lost, but, she was suing the UK government about erosion and ocean erosion. They're all these young people, women and men, trying to think of every way they can to try to address the climate crisis, calling companies out as appropriate, suing their governments, running for parliament. So I think that's a huge issue. I think also in this country right now, I think the issue around access to reproductive health care is huge. And I think is going to drive a lot of activism. But I do think climate is really an overriding issue. And interestingly, I would also say this because I hadn't thought about it much, but I went to a session when I was there about eco-anxiety and sort of the, like the mental health toll that a lot of young people feel because they feel their world is, not the world they want to live in. So I think we need to be mindful of, it's not just about policy advocacy, but making sure that people, particularly in, maybe that age range, feel that they also have the support to kind of figure out how to deal with anxiety they may have, or the challenges of just feeling their future is, not really a future they want.
So that would bring me to the second to last question.
Oh, good. Okay.
Who in particular can benefit from reading your book? And I know from talking with you that you did have in mind women under 40.
Yeah.
Do you see that as kind of the major audience for this? Or do you think it's really the whole span of women in their lives?
Well, I do think, really, I mean, obviously anyone can use it. I did focus on that age group, like kind of up to 35, because I felt like those were the people that, as I was talking to people around doing my, like speaking or at conferences, that had the most questions about what could I do? And really, we're still searching for how to think about, what organizations to be involved in, how to talk about issues. And so I think it's a book that's pretty usable across the board. I really did focus on like like your daughter, like Mia's generation, and a little bit older, but I think, yeah.
So in other words, it's a good late Hanukkah gift, a good Christmas
There you
gift,
go.
a good Kwanzaa gift.
Oh, sure,
Yeah.
all of the above.
And I don't know if you noticed, but this is completely accidental. I mean, it's kind of, it's a little weird.
It is,
but
but thank you.
It's cool. I mean,
Great.
I'm happy to be a poster child for
Very
your
good.
book. But I'm going to end with a question that I could have started with, but I didn't think of it, which is what brought you to your life's work in advocacy?
Well, I will answer very quickly because I see Nina's here. But, I say this in the book, and I think it's true. Like when I was a kid, so I grew up in an Italian Catholic household, and we went to Catholic church, of course. And I was wondered I really didn't understand why I could not be an altar boy. Kind of didn't really, I mean, today I find that kind of funny because it's not really something I think I would have aspired to really, but I really didn't know why. And when my mother told me that only boys could do that, it really made me mad. Also, when I said something about, she was talking about when he was doing something and she used that pronoun, and I said, but women could do that too. And she said, but that's what we use. He represents everybody. And I also thought, well, that seemed ridiculous. So that was why. I think I just, like at the beginning of my life, was like, this is crazy. So there you go.
Well, thank you for letting me.
Thank you. Thank you for being my friend too, Jen.
Oh, I'm so proud of you.
Oh, thank you.
I do have one last question. I want to thank everybody who was watching and encourage you to buy and read and act on the book. And I thought this was very meaningful, and hopefully people will forward it to other people. It will be on YouTube, so we'll post it sometime today. But I do have one more question for you,
Okay.
which is, what's next?
Well, what's next? Well, I am going to be writing another book, so that's exciting, with my business and writing partner, Susan Markham, who is not here. We're going to write a book on feminist foreign policy, very different than this. It's kind of the other end of the spectrum. It's an academic book. And then, just continuing all my work. And as I said, doing this short stint at the State Department, focusing on Afghanistan. So
Thank you.